Hello, everyone. I'm pleased to welcome you to today's webinar that is dedicated to the European and the German Supply Chain Due Diligence Act. We aim to provide you with guidance on the requirements for businesses, who it specifically applies to, and how to prepare for it. And for your information, we will record this session and send out the presentation to you afterwards. My name is Karin Ekberg, and I'm the founder and CEO of Leadership and Sustainability. I have a long experience in the sustainability area, and I'm looking forward to spending some time with you today discussing supply chain management. And this presentation has been developed by our team member, Julia. Just some basics about the Zoom webinar platform. You will all be muted during the webinar in order to ensure best audio quality. But please feel free to send us your question during the presentation via the question function. On the right-hand side, you can see a screenshot of the question function, and here you can find the button to open the Q&A window where you can type in your question and send it to us. And our agenda for today is we will discuss the current supply chain challenges and global trends, and then we will talk about the legislative landscape. We will talk about the EU Supply Chain Due Diligence Act. We will talk about the German Supply Chain Due Diligence Act, and also in general due diligence requirements for businesses, what you can expect and where you should fulfill requirements. And then we will talk about how you can manage your supply chain. So we will be talking a bit about our solutions and services and show you how our services can support you in this area. And we will also briefly introduce you to our company. And finally, we will have time for questions and discussion before we close the webinar. And we will now start by looking at some of the current supply chain challenges and global trends. Three of the most significant risks associated with supply chain practices in general in 2022 are political tensions, managing risks from forced labor, and increasing logistic costs and disruptions. And for companies or organizations just like yours, the legislative landscape is changing. And here are some examples of supply chain policies expected to go into effect between 2022 and 2024. The Forced Labor Prevention Act in the United States, the European Union Green Deal, the French Duty of Vigilance Act, the Australia Modern Slavery Act, the Supply Chain Due Diligence Act in the European Union, and the corresponding act in Germany. And let's begin with the European level. As the preparations for a European supply chain law are progressing, we will have a look at the rights. We will have a look at the rights and obligations imposed by the Supply Chain Due Diligence Act proposal of the European Commission. And before jumping into the details here, let's take a step back and look at existing frameworks. Until now, the European Union has followed the voluntary approach proposed by the two major international global frameworks. First, the UN Guiding Principle on Business and Human Rights, and then the OECD Guidelines for Multinational Enterprises, which are also available by sector. So, for example, there is also the OECD Due Diligence Guidance for the garment and footwear sector. But they have also proven that a voluntary approach does not sufficiently address the negative impacts of globalized business activities. And a best practice supply chain due diligence process consists of 7 steps. You see them here: mapping the supply chain, identifying impacts, risks, and action areas, analyzing gaps, adapting internal structures, and put the correct processes into place, formulating the requirements towards your suppliers, and then evaluating and reporting. And as already mentioned, the existing guidelines and the low level of implementation of them have proven that a voluntary approach does not sufficiently address the negative impacts of globalized business activities. Therefore, the European Commission published its draft legislative proposal in February 2022. The next steps are for this draft to go to the European Parliament and the EU Council for their approval. And the law was actually adopted on December 1st, 2022. The general approach reached completes the negotiation position agreed by the Council. It provides the Council presidency with a mandate to start negotiations with the European Parliament. So if and when adopted, finally, member states will have 2 years to translate the legislative directive into national law. And most probably this law will become effective from early 2023. When the European Commission presented its proposal in February, it would initially apply to EU companies with more than 500 employees and a global turnover of more than 150 million. Now, so it was actually, at the beginning, it was intended to have to be applicable for, yeah, exactly. Sorry for that. It was initially intended to be applicable to EU companies with more than 500 employees and a global turnover of more than 150 million. But the Council of the EU has now suggested a significantly different threshold with the rules, applying first to very large companies with more than 1,000 employees and 300 million worldwide turnover, or for non-EU companies, the same turnover within the European Union. And there has also been a change during the past weeks, and now it was proposed to use chain of activities instead of value chain, which would narrow down the scope to the supply chain, according to the explanatory notes that are available to us right now. And then 2 years later, smaller companies would be included. However, the numbers you see here, they may change in the meantime. So we are not sure about the final thresholds yet. And the EU Commission's SCDDA proposal applies to companies operating in high-risk sectors. And to these sectors are counted textiles and leather manufacturing, agriculture, forestry, fisheries, minerals, and mining. So let's go and have a look at the objectives of the law. Well, it is about bringing about change beyond European Union borders. It is about responsibilities for businesses regarding the social and environmental impact of their own operations, their subsidiaries' operations, and the suppliers' operations, to identify risks, prevent adverse impacts, etc. And that companies of a certain size, they also have to adopt a plan to ensure their business strategy is in line with the Paris Agreement. And verification of all companies accessing the EU internal market. National authorities should check the companies. And finally, it will also give victims the right to take European Union companies to court. And now let's talk about the German Supply Chain Due Diligence Act. The German federal government has already gone one step further. They didn't wait for the European Union. They have taken this step and they have set mandatory standards on the national level for businesses to be socially responsible. The so-called German Supply Chain Due Diligence Act will already come into force on the 1st of January 2023. Who will ultimately be affected by the new German supply chain law? Well, by the January the 1st, 2023, more than 600 companies with administrative headquarters or statutory seat or branches in Germany that employ at least 3,000 staff will be affected. And 1 year later, by January 1st, 2024, more than 2,900 companies that employ at least 1,000 staff will be affected. And the German SCDDA applies to main business areas and immediate suppliers. It applies further upstreams as well, but then with a bit of another wording. So here is some more basic information. It enters into force, as I mentioned, on January the 1st, 2023. It is no longer based on a voluntary approach, and it requires companies with head office in Germany to verify all direct suppliers for compliance with social and environmental standards. Regarding indirect suppliers, the companies must conduct a risk analysis if there is an indication that a violation is taking place at a supplier. It further allows victims within and outside Germany to sue businesses for harm caused. It is internationally compatible and based on the due diligence standard of the UNGPs, the United Nations Guidance Principles on Business and Human Rights, and Germany's National Action Plan. Breaches, they are sanctionable also for the first time, and there is a focus on remedial action, and it really moves from risk management only to also measuring impacts. So you may wonder if your business can still be impacted outside this specific scope, and yes, you may be affected. Your business may still be affected by business relationships and customer due diligence requests. So the consequence of non-compliance can be fines up to 800,000 euro or up to 2% of the global turnover for companies who are failing to meet the requirements. And another disadvantage can be, or a consequence can be, that these companies are excluded from public tenders for up to 3 years. And there have been 3 risk areas defined, 3 main risk areas. The first one refers to human rights and social standards. The second one refers to the environment. And the last one covers other aspects, like, for example, the use of security forces for the protection of entrepreneurial projects. And now, in the next section here, we will have a look at the due diligence requirements for businesses. So, to implement due diligence requirements imposed by the German law, it is recommended to follow a 7-step approach, consisting of risk analysis and management, a policy statement, preventive measures, remedial action, a complaints procedure. This is really important. We see that over and over again, how difficult it is for many companies to set up a truly credible and effective complaints procedure. And then indirect supplier instruments, monitoring, and finally also documentation and reporting. And these are all requirements that the German SCDDA actually have included into their legislation. And we will not provide you with a detailed guidance, what it needs to be considered under every single process step. So we have, for example, risk management system. This is the first part. You need to establish a risk management system. You need to have someone who is responsible for this area. You also should conduct a proper risk analysis. And further, you need to have a policy statement in place where you describe the risk management system. You should present the relevant risks and also the expectations that you have of your employees and suppliers. And then we come to preventive measures. We come also to remedial action and to the complaints procedure. And furthermore, the indirect supplier instruments is to set up a complaints procedure with the suppliers and enable anyone to report risks and violations to human rights or environment-related risks. And then we also have the monitoring, where you have to implement risk-based control measures. And finally, the documentation. So you will need to have an ongoing documentation of all your measures and your policy, etc. And then you also should publish an annual report within 4 months after the completion of the respective financial year. So you have time until end of April the following year to publish your report about all your policies and actions, etc. And so our recommendation is to prepare as soon as possible. And instead of just complying with the minimum requirements of the German SCDDA, we recommend that you start implementing a long-term strategy that already takes into account the European Union directive. And now, in the first instance, you have to understand how your business impacts people and the environment by mapping your business areas, your impact areas, sorry, and also undertaking a supply chain risk assessment, developing a strategy. As a second step, providing supplier support initiatives, building supply chain partnerships. And last but not least, you need also to measure your impact on people and the environment by means of an audit analysis, a human rights impact assessment, and worker service. And all of your actions taken require the transparent and public reporting. And we have come to our solutions and services, and I would like to show you some of the services we have that are, first I will give you a general overview, and then I would like to show you some of our specific services that can help you with the compliance. So this picture shows an overview of our services. Very generalized, we have 2 legs. One leg includes our work with brands and retailers on strategies, materiality and risk assessments, reporting, as well as other consulting projects. Examples are carbon footprinting and materials consulting. And the other leg focuses on the supply chain. And let's go there. So we can support you in managing your entire supply chain aligned with, for example, HIG FEM and FSLM or SOCP, but also aligned with other programs. We can support you with materiality and risk assessments, understanding where the main impacts, risks, and opportunities are, including also country risk assessments. We can support you with the supply chain strategy and program, with developing a code of conduct, verification and audit program. We can support you with developing handbooks, guidelines, and goals and action plans, trainings, and consulting. And furthermore, of course, we can guide you towards your compliance to the German or the European Union SCDDA. And now I would like to give you a few examples of what it can look like. So our generic risk assessment process, it looks like this. We will estimate risks and prioritize them depending on likelihood and severity. We look at status, impacts, risks, and opportunities. We define the value chain, and then we define the sustainability aspects that we want to include. They are always tailor-made depending on the needs and the situation of the respective company we are working with or organization we are working with. And then we also include risk factors according to, for example, the HIG BRM, the brand and retail module, such as sector risks, business model risks, sourcing model risks, or product risks. And then as an option, we can take it into two steps. We can do a generic business model without your own programs, and we can also add on your program and then define the impacts, risks, and opportunities with the implementation of your programs evaluated as well. And then the detailed results you saw on the previous slides, they are summarized into what we call the hotspot analysis, where the risks and opportunities are clearly identifiable through the aggregation of the scores and also through color coding. So this is also a tool that you can use when you talk to your management about the results, and where you can then show where are the main areas for me to act which are of course the main significant impacts and risks that you have, but also your significant opportunities. And this is often forgotten. Also, for example, opportunities are of course not included in due diligence principles or requirements, but opportunities are so important when it comes to sustainability, because there are actually lots of opportunities out there or within your organization, within your supply chain, to improve the performance without always having the pressure of risk management. Sometimes they are interlinked. When you lower your risks, you may then generate more opportunities. But sometimes there are actually, let's say, singular opportunities that are there to develop further. So we really suggest that you always think about opportunities as well. And this is also, by the way, when you want to sell in your sustainability strategy or your supply chain strategy internally, the opportunities are always also good measures to talk about. So on this slide, we give you also an introduction about the country risk assessment. So it's very similar to what we were looking at previously, but here we are now looking at the individual countries. And this is quite a complex analysis to do. There are lots of resources out there available to conduct country risk assessments, but they are very different in their scope. Some of them cover several countries for one topic. Some of them cover only one country for a few topics, etc. So there is a multitude of different studies and evaluations that you need to take into account when you conduct the country risk assessment. So the approach is to identify and evaluate the country-specific risks and determine the impact and risk areas and also mitigation actions as far as possible, and then develop a risk-informed sustainability action plan or strategy as a source also of competitive advantage and risk minimization. At the local facility level, we can support you with HIG-FEM trainings and verifications. The HIG-FEM measures and quantifies the sustainability impacts of a facility. It reduces redundancy in measuring and reporting sustainability performance, because the facility completes the HIG-FEM once and verifies it once, but can then make the results available to all brands and organizations that are their business partners. So it therefore also drives business value through reducing risk and uncovering efficiency. It creates a common means and language to communicate sustainability to stakeholders. And for social aspects, we use, for example, the FSLM SLCP and deliver trainings and verifications. SLCP promotes safe and fair social and working conditions for the workers and supports the management and improvement of your supply chain and strategic projects. And we have HIG-FEM and SLCP verifiers in around 10 countries, among others in Germany, in Romania, in Bulgaria, in Turkey, in Pakistan, in India, in Bangladesh, in Indonesia, in China, Vietnam, and Tunisia. And we do work also with other programs, so please reach out to us and ask which programs we are working on. For example, we are developing our own ISO system so that we will be able to deliver many other certification services as well. And now I would just like to show you some of our team members. Currently, we are more than 40 persons together globally, and here you see some of them. And then now I would like to open up for questions, and let's have a look if there are any questions here. Let me see. Yes, someone asked if there will be slides distributed after the webinar. Yes, everyone who has registered will receive the slides after the webinar, so that's fine. Any other questions or comments or input? Yeah, here we have several questions coming in. When you refer to direct suppliers, what exactly does it mean? Well, this means the suppliers with whom you have a direct contract. So those are the direct suppliers with whom you have a contract. But there is also a clause in the German legislation that you cannot, how do you say that, avoid that. So if you just have a middleman, so to say, in between, then and the middleman has the contract with a manufacturing entity, then you are actually also responsible for that manufacturing entity. Yes. Yes, and the penalties, as I mentioned, for the European Union Due Diligence Act, we are not clear about what the penalties are, but for the German one, I mentioned that it can be up to 800,000 euro or even up to 2% of the annual revenue. So very significant amounts, actually. Yes, and do we know when the requirements are going to be published on European Union level? So no, we don't know exactly. We hope that it will be at some time at the beginning of next year. But this process is, as you know, also may take some time. There are clearly negotiations taking place, as I mentioned, because the thresholds have been changed since the original draft of the law. Yeah, let us see here. And there is a question here, will companies that have offices in Germany but their main office elsewhere be affected? Yeah, it depends on the revenue that you are doing in Germany. Yes. Yes, and here is another question. How a textile supplier from India or Bangladesh is affected of this new law? You would not be directly affected just because of the legal requirements, but it may be that companies that are buying from you will now ensure stricter processes, depending on how they have been working before. But now, as I mentioned, all the requirements that are there, they will need to fulfill those requirements, which may mean that they will also cascade further requirements to you based on those legal requirements here in Germany. Let me see. Yes, how does this Supply Chain Due Diligence Act differ or relate to the CSRD, so the reporting directive? Those are two different directives. So they are just two different directives, but obviously in the reporting directive, you will also need to report report about your supply chain practices. Okay, and then a follow-up question here, but then upstream factories doing wet processes, for instance, with whom we have no direct contract, are out of the scope. In the German legislation, they are not entirely out of the scope, but if you have a notion, or if there is an evidence that there may be, or if there may be a risk in the upstream supply chain, then you actually have to conduct a risk analysis and of course take the corresponding actions based on the results from that risk analysis. So it's not a clear boundary there. You may have, but it's not as if you have to include them from the very beginning into your entire program. Okay, thank you so much. Best regards back. Yes, may I ask if there is any specific definition for the tier in the supply chain? I'm looking for how deep the law planning to check. Yes, tier 1 is usually the final factory that assembles the product. So from where the final product is leaving, that is what we usually call tier 1. But depending on where you sit in the supply chain, it may be different, or there may be different terminologies that are used. So that is why, for example, the German supply chain law does not speak about tiers. They speak about the immediate suppliers instead. How can brands, retailers become part of the discussions and negotiations on EU level? Yes, the best is to go via your different associations. So depending on where you have your branch association, then you may want to engage there. But it really differs from company to company. Some are involved with FESI, for example, with the European Sporting Goods Industry Association, or there may be other associations as well. Yes, follow up on reporting. Do we have to publish an additional report, or can it be included in the sustainability report / integrated report? As far as I know, it can be included into the overall sustainability or integrated report that you will publish, as long as you have the information available and published that are required by the legislation. Most of our factories have done the HIC-FEM, the facility environmental module. Does this measure fulfill the scope of the due diligence? It fulfills one part of it, but it doesn't fulfill the overall risk management process and analysis that you still need to have in place. So obviously, when the factories are using the HIG facility environmental module, that's one way, that's the audit part of the different requirements. Okay, any further questions? We still have some time. Another question, in general, do you think that the LKSG, so this is the German Supply Chain Due Diligence Act, if it is strict enough? Well, at least it is a big step, I think. And when we look at the environmental requirements in the law, it seems that the European Union legislation will be stricter because it more specifically lists many different impact categories, or more specific impact categories than what we have in the German Supply Chain Act. But in the German Supply Chain Act, it's basically a bit of a broad definition of the risk of pollution, which can, of course, include anything, even if it's not specified in every detail. So if it's strict enough, I think we will see also when it comes to the implementation and the monitoring by the authorities and how strict it is. As I mentioned at the very beginning, there is the understanding that the voluntary approach is not really enough to ensure really diligent supply chain measures. Yeah, regarding the European Union directive, I don't know exactly when it will come into force. One more question here. What suppliers in manufacturing countries should prepare already for the upcoming requirements, given the fact that there's not yet instruction from their buyers? What they are doing now as part of their compliance program would be sufficient. Well, I mean, it's a general question, but of course it really depends on the individual manufacturing entity. So you will need to have a look there. Do you have the programs in place? What are your results with the HIG-FEM, or if you are doing the step by Oecotex, or if you are doing Bluesign audits, whatever audits you are doing, and there are of course many others than just the HIG-FEM out there. And you need to basically ask yourself, is what we are doing really enough in order to ensure the due diligence? And so you also need to think about it like this. It is really about minimizing the risks that you cause harm, either to people in the factory or in the nearest communities, or to the environment. So it's really about minimizing the risks and making sure that no negative accidents or occurrences can happen. Yes. Okay. This seems to be all for now. So with that, I want to thank you so much for joining this webinar. You will receive the presentation in a few days from now. I would say not today, but at the beginning of next week, you will receive the presentation. And thank you so much for joining. And also please feel free to contact us at any time. I think you have our contact details, and otherwise you can find it on our website, leadership-sustainability.com. And in the presentation, there are also some links to different additional resources that you can use. We conduct webinars quite often. There are many different topics that we have already discussed in our webinars: HIG-FEM, SOCP, reporting, the brand and retail module, and many other topics. So please feel free to use the resources that are available. And with that, I will say goodbye and thank you so much for joining.